Hey guys, it's Courtney, and today I am creating a one-layer scene with the All Tucked In stamp set by MFT. So this stamp set is perfect for kind of perspective scene building, I guess you could say, because everything is sort of at an angle. So I'm going to use that to my advantage. So first I'm going to line up this little nightstand here because this will be in front of everything. Going to go ahead and stamp that all the way off to the left-hand side with Blackout ink by Ink on 3, and I'm stamping on a piece of Nina Solar White 80-pound cardstock. I'm also stamping this onto a piece of masking paper. This is Simon Says Stamp masking paper. You can use any masking paper that you have in your stash, especially being I'm doing no ink blending, so it doesn't really matter how tacky it is. Going to go ahead and fussy cut this out right directly on the outline, and you can see that I'm pretty much moving the paper and keeping my scissors somewhat straight. This makes it easy to kind of get in those little teeny tiny areas. I didn't bother to cut out the bottom portion because I'm not going to be stamping over that area anyway, so I just didn't waste my time. So I went ahead and masked out that nightstand, and now I want to stamp out the cat. I want the cat to appear as if she or he is on the bed. So I'm going to line up the bed, then line up my little cat, close my MISTI door. That way I can keep that little cat stamp in place, stamp that down, and also stamp that onto a piece of another piece of masking paper, cut that out and mask that out before realigning that large stamp. I went ahead and stamped this one out twice because there's a lot of blank areas. So I don't want to really squish my ink pad too much and get ink on those blank areas, stamp that down and get smudges where I don't want them. So it's just easier to kind of go with a light pressure and stamp it twice. So I didn't bother to mask this out because I'm not going to stamp anything over it, but I am going to kind of create my room. I do want to apologize for the light that you see. I have a little bit of sun coming through the window, and you can see as the video goes on, it will kind of move and gradually disappear. So it's a little distracting now, but I promise it will go away in a minute. So I did have some ink smudges that I'm just going to clean up with a sand eraser, which is a lifesaver and a very inexpensive tool, and to me, a must-have in the craft room. Going to bring out my ruler here and a pencil, and I'm kind of just going along with the angle of the bed. So I'm using the base or the footboard, I think it's called, of the bed to kind of guide me for the angle that I need for my wall, or yeah, I guess my wall, you could say. And then I'm going to create the other wall, and the corner, and I want there to be a window. So I have to kind of go along with the shape of the room. So we're pretty much looking straight on to the corner. So each side is going to be a little bit angled, if that makes any sense. So my window will be as well. So it won't be as angled the closer it is to the center, but the closer it moves out to the side of the card, it'll be a little bit more angled. And you'll see once I fill everything in what I mean. So I'm going to stamp this little bird here that's holding the teddy bear right there in the window, as well as the little slippers on the floor in front of the bed. And there's a little picture. Well, there's two little pictures, but I'm just using one and hanging that directly over the bed. Next, I can go in with a Copic Safe pen and kind of fill everything in, go directly over those pencil lines, fix any mistakes that I may have at this point. But I'm using an EK Success journaling pen. They are, to me, what I've found that works the best, that's the cheapest. I have heard, though, that they are discontinuing them. So if you've ever used them and you like them, get your hands on them now because they won't be around much longer. So I know I'm going to order a few sets from Amazon very, very soon. So I went ahead and went directly over those pencil lines around the window, and now I'm going to create a frame around the window just so that it's not just a square or a rectangle, I guess. And then I'm going to go directly over the lines for my wall, my corner, and where the wall meets the floor, I guess you could say. Now, before I do any of my coloring, I do want to make sure that I erase all of my pencil lines that might be showing through. Once you color over them, you will not be able to erase them. So make sure that you erase those before you start your coloring. So I'm going to go ahead and start off with the wall. And I will apologize now because the first part of the coloring, or the first half of the coloring, I should say, I zoomed in way too much. And sometimes I'm a little off camera, but I will explain everything that I'm doing. And then once I noticed it, I zoomed out just a little bit. So I'm going to go in with my C5 and I'm going to add the darkest areas. Now you'll see that I'm not doing any flicking here, just to show you that you can get this pretty much the same results from no flicking. I am adding shadows where the corner is, so where the two walls come together. And I'm also creating a shadow where the wall meets the floor and on the left, bottom left of each thing. So on the bottom left of the window, bottom left of that picture frame, and as well as the headboard of the bed. Next, I'm going to go in with the C3 and I'm just going to extend these areas out a little bit further. So I'm going directly over the C5 and just extending it out. That way the two colors will blend nicely and you'll get more of a seamless blend that way. Next, I'm going to go in with the C1 and I'm going to do the same exact thing. I'm just going to go directly over where I had that C3 and I'm just going to extend it out even further. You can see in the larger areas, I'm using more of the side of my nib, and where I get to these smaller areas or where there's just not as much of room to add a bunch of shadows, I'm using more of the tip. Next, I'm going to go in with the C00, which is nearly a colorless blender. And I'm going to go ahead and do the same thing here. And you'll see that the paper gets saturated a little bit. And it's mainly just with that alcohol or that blending solution, because the lighter the color, the more of that it has. So you may not get the full effect of it until it completely dries. I did go quickly over the areas with a colorless blender just to get a little bit more of a seamless blend. Again, this is going to saturate your paper, so it's going to look a little bit different than it will a minute or two from now. It dries fairly quickly, so you'll be able to see what it looks like. If you're not happy with it, wait a minute or two because it will look different. Next, I'm going to move on to the floor and I'm going to bring out some BG markers. Again, going right in with that darkest color to add the darkest areas, which will be where the floor and the wall meet. And I'm also going to add shadows underneath each one of the bedposts as well as the nightstand. Again, kind of concentrating my shadows being towards the left-hand side. Next, going in with the BG15, again, doing the same thing as I did with those grays, just extending these shadows out a little bit further. And then finally, I will bring in the BG11, which is a really, really light color. You may have to use the tip-to-tip technique if your colors aren't blending well, but I'm just going to go over the entire thing. The large area where it's kind of just no shading at all, you may have to go over it more than once just so that you don't get those streaky lines that the alcohol markers sometimes give you. I did have to refill my marker, which is another good tip. Make sure your marker is nice and filled up before filling in a huge area like this. So next we're going to move on to the coloring of the objects themselves. And I'm going to start with some E30 markers. And I'm going to be coloring a lot of things with this color combination. So I'm going to start off with the picture frame above the bed. And I had a little bit of a globby issue, or a blobby issue, I should say, with my E37, which is the scary dark color. And so I did have to go back in once my coloring was done of the frame with a colorless blender just to kind of get that pushed back, push that color back where it belongs. A colorless blender will not erase color and it will not blend color, but it will move the color. So whenever you have to use your colorless blender to fix a coloring mistake, kind of move the color in the direction where you want it to be. And you're kind of just like sweeping it back in, if that makes any sense. So next, moving on to the bed frame, the footboard, the headboard, and as well as the nightstand. Again, I'm concentrating my darkest areas being off to the left-hand side, and then I'll blend that out each time, and I'm using the same exact color combination for this entire thing, basically, in many, many areas with the E30s. But I am adding a little bit more shading on that larger area of the footboard, just so that you can see a little bit more variation in color. Now the bedposts themselves, they're pretty teeny tiny. You don't have to use all four colors, but I do recommend you use your darkest and your lightest. If you are able to fit three, use a mid-tone in there, but the darkest and the lightest is what's going to give you that contrast. Remember, that scary dark color is what you may be missing if you're not getting the contrast you're looking for. And if you are using the scary dark, try to use a scary light, a color that is so significantly lighter than what you want your object to be, and you'll get even more contrast. So whenever you have a very small area and you can't fit multiple colors, you may only be able to fit 2, make sure they're contrasting colors. They're far apart on the spectrum so that you still get that contrast you're looking for. So I'm going to do the same thing for the headboard as well. Now these little circles or these little knobs that come up, I am leaving just a little bit of a highlight off to the left-hand side, and this will give it more of a round appearance once everything's done. The only shading that I really did for those little knobs, I don't even know if they're knobs, but you guys know what I mean. I'm just basically creating a C so that it's in the same shape as the circle, but I am just leaving that small little highlight off to the left-hand side and filling that in with that E31, which is the lightest color. Now for the nightstand, I'm going to do the same thing here, just concentrating my darkest areas being off to the left-hand side. For the drawers, I'm pretty much doing the same thing, but there's kind of like a frame, I guess you could call it, on the outside of the drawers, and I want to keep those. I'm going to end up coloring over those because I need them to stand out so that it doesn't look so flat, but we'll worry about that later. For now, I'm just using my E30 markers to basically get my shading right. I'm also creating a shadow. There's a stack of books on top of the nightstand. I'm also creating a shadow there, off to the left-hand side, bottom left. So you want to keep when you're doing a scene like this, you want to make sure that your shadows are consistent. They don't have to be, well, I don't want to even say consistent because nobody's really going to notice if you end up putting a shadow on the right-hand side, but you just want to add shadows to any object that's on top of another or next to another. You want to make sure that you're creating a shadow there, and that's what's going to give you the dimension, whether your light source is correct or not. So next, I'm going to go move on to the window frame here, and I forgot to kind of frame it in, if that makes sense. So I did take my EK Success journaling pen out again and just connect the corners, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading to each one of the corners and leaving the center part of each part of the frame for the E31, which is the lightest color. So I've been MIA for a couple of days in case you haven't noticed, and the main reason is that I have been working my butt off on Kit Week, which starts this Saturday, the 25th of January. And I knew that it would take me a long time to do and go through all of these kits, but I didn't realize how much time it was going to take. So that's why I've been a little absent lately. I've just been working really hard to get that done. I am about halfway through all of the kits, so we should be good. We definitely have Saturdays, Sundays, and Mondays scheduled, so we are good to go. But it should be interesting. It was a lot of fun to do. It's still a lot of fun to do, especially using kits that I've never used before. So hopefully you guys enjoy this series. So next I'm moving on to the outside of the window. So I'm basically creating a little scene outside. And I'm going to bring in some G markers, the G02 on the bottom, blend that out with the G02. Then I'm going to bring in, the G02, then the G00. Then I'm bringing in the B00, and I'm kind of just blending that in with that G00 for where the ground meets the sky, I guess. You can make as much detail as you want outside. I'm keeping it kind of simple. Moving on to the B12 on the very top, I'm just being careful not to go over my bird too much. And then I'm going to work in the opposite direction to get my colors to blend. So I'm going to move back to that B00 and back to the G00 to get those two colors to blend a little bit. So next we are going to move on to basically everything else. And here is where I am off camera quite a bit, but I'm adding a little bit of shading to his pillow, and I'm just adding a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side, but also where there's kind of indentations to give the pillow a little bit of shape. And I'm just using some C markers for this because I want this to appear white. Next, I am going to go ahead and move on to the rabbit himself, and I'm going to move on to some warm grays. And again, just concentrating my darkest areas being off to the left-hand side. My W5 will be the darkest for this rabbit, and then I will blend that out with the W3, and then the W1 for the right-hand side. I did go directly over the inside of his ears with that W1. I end up bringing in an R20 just for the inside of his ears and just to add a little bit of color to his cheeks. But by going over the inside of his ears with the W1, it kind of tones down that R20 so it's not so pink. I'm going to use this same color combination for this little rabbit that's part of this picture frame, or part of this picture, I should say, and I'm coloring him the same exact way. The shading being off to the left-hand side, same color combination, R20 for the inside of his ears. For the cat, I'm going to keep these warm gray markers out, but this time I'm going to bring in the W7 for my darkest color. And again, concentrating the left-hand side being my darkest area, but I am also creating a shadow where his hind leg is, or I guess, would it be their hip? I don't know, but where it's kind of tucked up, I guess. And also his tail and his little paws are underneath his face. He kind of sleeps just like Frankie does. And blending that out with the W5, W3, and the W1 again. Now, this image already has stripes on it, so I don't have to worry about shading those. Those are already there. So for the little pig, or this stuffed animal pig that's on the bed, I am going to bring in my R22 as being my darkest color, and I'm really doing the shading the same exact way here. The R02 will be my mid-tone, and then I will finish off with the R00 for the highlight color. Now for the blanket on, well, the folded blanket, I should say, on the edge of the bed, I'm going to bring in some RV60 markers. Now, I only have 3 of these, and honestly, I haven't found another color that will blend nicely with them, so I'm going to just going to stick to the 3 colors, but I am saturating the darkest areas with my lightest color first, because these colors are so far apart. I want to make sure that my paper is nice and saturated, so that way it will blend a little bit easier. I'm going to add a little bit of shading at the bottom of the blanket that's closest to the floor, and also where it meets the top of the bed off to the left-hand side. Also creating a shadow underneath the little stuffed animal as well as underneath the little cat. Then I'll blend that out with the RV66 and then finish back off with that RV63 that we started with. I'm going to use this same color combination for, I'm going to call it a her because of the colors that we're using, but it really doesn't matter. But I'm going to use the same colors for her, I don't know whether it's a shirt or PJs or whatever she's got on. I'm going to use the same color, and I'm just going to add a little bit of shading off to the left-hand side and also underneath her little collar. And there's not a whole lot of area to work with here, so it really doesn't matter where you put your shadows. I'm also going to use this same color combination for the slippers that are on the floor. Again, just adding a little bit of shading to the left-hand side and also where the top portion of the slippers kind of hangs off the bottom part, I guess. And then we're going to move on to the other blanket that is on the bed. I guess this would be maybe the sheets or the comforter, whatever it is. I'm going to switch over to a different RV combination here. And again, I'm going to put my shading the same way, closest to the floor and also where it starts to bend over the top portion of the bed, creating a shadow underneath the cat. And also there's a little wavy line there where she's kind of tucked under the sheet or under the blanket. So I'm going to use that to my advantage and kind of just extend that area out. That way the lightest area will be where the blanket is the most elevated, where she's tucked under it. Going to go ahead and blend those areas out with the RV25, then the RV23, and then I'll finish off with the RV21 as being my lightest color. Now there's little stripes that are on the top portion of this blanket. So I'm going to use my RV20s and RV60s to just color in every other stripe. I am not worried about shading here, but I'm just taking one of the midtones. You don't necessarily, when you're doing something like this, you don't want to necessarily use the darkest or the lightest. You want to kind of stick to the midtones. That way it'll blend in nicely with everything else that you have going on. For the sheet that's underneath her, I wanted this to appear white as well. So I'm going to bring back in those C markers and just add a little bit of shading underneath the pillow and underneath the blankets. Now for the little fishbowl there, I was completely off camera, so I just ended up cutting it out. But I used a B000 for the water, and then I used a YR07, YR04, and a Y35 for the fish. Now for the books, I'm bringing in some E70 markers, and again, just using the fishbowl to create a shadow onto the top, or the top book. And then for the bindings of the book, I'm just adding a little bit of shading on the top and bottom because they're kind of bowed out. If you ever look at the binding of a book, it's kind of bowed out a little bit. So that part that's bowed out the most would be the lightest. Going to do the same thing with the E18 and E15. And again, these are contrasting enough where I can get away with just using the two colors. The E70s, not so much. The E79 is super dark, and then the next closest one is the E74, and they're pretty far apart from one another, but then the 71 and 70 really aren't. So by bringing in that E79, I really get that contrast that I'm looking for. Now, as I'm looking at this window and my little scene outside, it's looking like it is pretty bare and it doesn't really look like it's the outside. So I wanted to add a little bit more of a scene that's going on out there rather than just the blue and the green for the grass and the sky. So while I have my E70 markers out, I'm going to create some trees out there. Very, very, very simple trees. So I'm going to take my E74 and I'm just going to basically draw the branches and the trunk of the trees. I'm going to put one on either side, and you don't have to have any artistic skill for this at all. It's just basically wavy lines. And then I'm going to bring back in the E79 just to add a tiny bit of shading, and I'm adding this to some random areas just so that it's not one solid color. And I did blend those areas out just a teeny tiny bit with that E74 again. Now for the leaves, I'm going to bring in some greens, and I just randomly picked them, so it really doesn't matter. And all I'm going to do is create dots, just dots. That's it. But you want to make sure that you're using multiple colors here so that it does look like leaves once everything is said and done. I used 2 different colored greens here, and then I'm going to bring in the RV25, which is a darker pink because I have a lot to kind of go over, and I want there to be some buds on these trees because I'm thinking spring. I'm looking outside and it's 9 degrees, so I am thinking spring. So next we're going to go ahead and move on to this bird, and I want this bird to be blue, but I don't want it to blend in too much with the background of the outside. So I'm going to kind of go a little bit darker than I normally do. So there's 2 little sections, I guess you could say, on this bird. So for this first part, I'm going to use the B18 as my darkest color. For the wings and the tail, there's basically just feathers. So I'm just adding some random flick lines just to have some texture there, but I'm really not worried about the actual shadows. I'm going to blend that out with the B05, then the B04, and then finish off with the B02 for the highlight areas. And that way you'll have a little bit of texture with all 4 of those blues within those feathers. For the rest of his little body there, I'm going to use a different blue combination, which once I started to use, I realized that the colors were way too similar to one another, and I really wasn't getting the contrast that I was looking for. I did add a little bit of shading to the top portion of his little beak and off to the left-hand side. And as I'm blending this out with colors that are supposed to be different, they really weren't too much different. So in order to still get that contrast, I don't have another marker that's going to closely match these for a highlight color. So once I colored everything in, I'm going to quickly go over the lightest area, or what I want to be my lightest area, with my colorless blender. And again, kind of just push that color back to the darkest area. Didn't get a lot of contrast, but I certainly got a lot more than what I started with. Now, as I'm looking at my little room scene here, I hate it. So I don't like the white walls. I want this to be bright and cheery, and I didn't like the white. So I, in my opinion, now pretty much ruined the card. I should have went with a lighter RV marker, but instead I went with an RV11, and I went over all of the walls. I already have the shading there from the gray marker, so I don't have to worry about shading, but it was a little bit too bright. I probably should have went with an RV00, but at this point, I have about an hour and a half into the card, and I've done this recording, and I'm going to share it anyway. It's certainly bright. It served its purpose, I guess you could say. So I'm going to go ahead and use those same orange markers that I used for the little fish for the bird's beak. And then I'm going to bring back out those E30 markers for this little teddy bear that he is holding. And I'm just adding a little bit of shading off pretty much to the center. I'm keeping a center light source here because there's such a little amount of room to work with here. So once all of my coloring was done, I'm looking and I'm still hating it. And at this point, I was very much debating on just turning off the camera and just forget about this video. But I decided to share anyway. I did go back in and add a little bit of shading underneath the slippers, and then to add a little bit of patterns, I guess you could say, I'm bringing out my white gel pen, and I'm just going to add some dots on top of this folded blanket on the edge of the bed. And I added a few white gel pen details to some random areas, and this will kind of boost up your coloring. And in my case, I was hoping that it boosted up the whole card, but not my luck. Anyways, once everything was completed, I went ahead and took one of the sentiments from the same stamp set and stamped that with some VersaFine Onyx Black ink in the lower left-hand corner, and that is it. As always, I will leave the supplies listed in the description box below. Thank you guys so much for stopping by today, and have a great day. Bye.